Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my update to the Giga Spellblade build. This time with a tier list. I went through and tested pretty much every hit-based skill I could think of for spells, and I tested them on Uber Shaper. You'll see in my stash, I have actually done what appears to be about 57 Uber Shapers. I have this tab and this tab if you're curious about roughly the drops I got. There were 2 Sublime Visions. Weirdly enough, my first 2 Shaper kills of the kill back-to-back were Sublime Visions. Haven't seen one since, but that was a little cool. Anyways, we did about 57 Uber Shapers, and from my testing, I made this list. Now, I will specify that I did not min-max for any one of these abilities. I basically kept my tree as it was based on the tree you saw in the previous video. It was pretty much the same thing there. And I would change it slightly, just very slightly, for things like, for example, if I played a brand skill, I would respec just a couple passives and I would grab runebinder. Or if I wanted to test out a totem build, I would grab ancestral blonde, shockwave totem, and holy flame totem for examples. Those are the totem skills I tested that were just totem based spell skills. I didn't do any other respecking, any other min-maxing, so certain skills on here will be lower tier than they would be if you optimized for them, but I didn't do any of that optimization myself. That being said, if you're looking over this list and you're thinking, wow, there's some good skills that are lower rated, why is that? For example, Ice Spear. I played Ice Spear as a caster, as a self-caster. This skill had great damage. It had terrible clear. And that's why it's in C tier for me. It was an abysmal clear. It felt terrible. I wouldn't recommend it to play as a self-caster because of that. I think Ice Spear is a fantastic skill when it comes to cast on crit, where it has the auto-targeting and you're always hitting it perfectly like that. That's fantastic. But when it comes to clear and you're self-casting it, you just miss a whole lot of monsters, and it's just not very good in my opinion. So that's why I'm rating it like this, in case you're wondering. That is my reasoning behind this, and I'll go through each of the skills now, try to talk through one by one what they were good at. For example, my 2 S tier skills were Blade Fall and Reap. Now, Reap, I kind of expected. Reap with a Awakened Spell Cascade, you can get 2 to 3 hits on it. You can get blood charges. You have Val Reap for even higher blood charges. It actually hits very, very hard. And if you roll with Intensify, where you have big AoE while mapping, and then you go to do single target, the stacks will get basically smaller and smaller, make it a little bit easier to multi-hit. It's a pretty good experience just out of the box without even really any investment in AoE or any investment just by swapping in the correct gem links. That being said, that's contingent on Awakened Spell Cascade. Awakened Spell Cascade is expensive, and if you can't afford it, it would go from an S tier much, much lower, because I think without Awakened Spell Cascade, I think Reap is really, really rough. So keep that in mind. Blade Fall is a similar situation. Blade Fall was very, very high damage. Weirdly enough, I didn't expect this. I was very surprised, but apparently Blade Fall just hits really hard, and it hits a lot of times. When you have Awakened Cascade with Intensify and it shrinks that AoE, you actually get a lot of overlapping hits. And this one surprised me the most out of the box. Out of all the skills I tried, it was actually very high damage. And on top of that, when you're not specifically doing your Intensify, focusing on one target, and you're just mapping around, it has big AoE. It hits almost the whole screen just without any real investment into AoE. So that's why they're my S tier skills. They were some of the best skills damage-wise, and they could do clear quite well. Granted, they are being supported by Awakened Spell Cascade, which is very expensive, so keep that in mind when you're choosing your skills. Following up those skills, we have Impending Doom. This was a mid-tier damage, but this was probably my favorite skill in terms of clear. You didn't really need Spell Echo on it. It is a curse you're casting, which has a very fast cast time, and it has a very big AoE. Again, this uses Awakened Spell Cascade. I think this is an example where you could get away with regular Cascade, and maybe you could get away with regular Cascade with Blade Fall, and it would feel still pretty good, and that's why I rated it highly. Although other skills on the list, for example, Eye of Winter, Firestorm, Blazing Salvo, these were skills that were all much higher damage than Impending Doom per se, but they weren't quite as good clear. They had decent clear, but when it came to damage, they excelled at it, but I think they were just a little bit lower on clear compared to Reap and Bladefall, who were skills that had similar damage to these, or maybe higher damage, while also having better clear. Next up, Creeping Frost, weirdly enough, was actually really freaking good. With the Awakened GMP, you get basically 6 or 7 projectiles all shotgunning the same target. Its single target's insane. And then it can also have some decent clear because it has a fairly decent cast time, and you're shooting out 7 AoE damaging projectiles. So your GMP works as a both damage and a clear based support gem and makes it work out pretty well. After that, we have the brands, Armageddon and Stormbrand. These are skills that were very high quality of life. You put the brands on the enemy, you walk around, the enemy dies pretty fast. They're pretty good damage wise, and they're offering decent clear because you just pop them as you go and they hit some packs, they clear the packs, and you just keep moving. Pretty high quality of life. Weirdly enough, I didn't expect to rate Arc this highly, but when I tried Arc, I realized something. It's pretty decent damage, and Val Arc is just insane. It's something that has very low cooldown, which means while you're mapping, you get to press this button basically every other screen. It felt like when I tested this out, basically I tried it in some mapping situations a little bit. It felt like Val Arc had very high uptime, which made the clear feel pretty amazing, and the targeting was also very smooth. It was kind of auto lock in, didn't have to think about it too much, and I was just zapping away. So Arc, weirdly enough for me, I was expecting to rate this as kind of a C average middle of the lane skill, but playing with it when you have enough damage, it just feels pretty good because it's got pretty good clear innately, and Val Arc is pretty sick, along with giving you lucky hits, which works great because our damage range is massive. After that, we have Cremation. Cremation's a skill I've never built with before, but it did have insane damage, and it has pretty dang big AoE from my little test with it. Just doing a 2-button playstyle isn't ideal, but they're both very fast casts, and this skill does what I could feel like was insane damage with very low maintenance in terms of me having to think what I was doing. I would just pop them up, have them going during the boss fight. They would just do the entire Shaper phase while I walked around. It was pretty chill. Similar to Brands, these skills have a little bit more involvement because you have to do basically 1 Desecrate cast and then 3 Cremation casts or whatever it is. But it was fantastic damage-wise, and I didn't even have the enchant, which gives a whole additional maximum geyser, along with actual specific investment into AoE to making them shotgun more. I think would be an end up fantastic time. So I actually rated Cremation pretty highly. Following up my A tier skills, the B tier skills were a mixture of just fairly good damage or fairly good clear, but a little bit lacking in one or the other, or not just excelling in one or the other, being mostly just pretty average. And that was things like Shock Nova, pretty good damage, okay clear. Freezing Pulse, respectable damage, okay clear. Ball Lightning, pretty good damage, a little bit worse in the clear, but decent clear. Flame Blast, very good damage, but really lacking in clear. Having to do the Channel Explode is not a great playstyle, and you'll see that that's where most of the other decent damage channeling skills went. Divine Ire, Stormburst, all kind of the same things. Not great for clear, but fairly good on damage. Then we have things like Spark, which weirdly enough, without cast speed or without proj speed scaling and without duration scaling, this skill still felt pretty dang good, weirdly enough, which I was kind of surprised about. I thought I was going to be rating Spark much lower because I have no proj speed and no duration investment, but Spark still did pretty good. Next up, we have Purifying Flame, fairly average damage, fairly average clear, pretty middle of the road. Exsanguinate was a little bit lower on the damage end, but as the clear speed GG scenario where if you just put chain on it, you're just hitting the entire screen, it ends up working out pretty well. So Exsanguinate, I'd actually rate pretty highly just because of its clear, even though it probably belongs in C for its damage being a little bit lower. Hex Blast was great damage, but Hex Blast requires you to run a Blasphemy, and it requires you to get a Curse on hit, and there's a lot more setup that you'd have to change some things in the build to really make it work, so I just rate it lower for that alone. Then we have Magma Orb, pretty okay clear, pretty okay damage. Dark Pact, similar thing, pretty okay clear, pretty okay damage. Crackling Lance, a frustrating clear because sometimes you just shoot at a pack and it doesn't kill a monster, which is why I don't like Crackling Lance. I'm definitely biased, but it had really good damage. A Shock, Lightning Conduit, and Orb of Storms. I actually did these as a pairing, basically using them in combination with each other, basically so I could put down Orb of Storms and do Lightning Conduit at the same time. It was actually very respectable damage, but a very awkward button play style where every single pack you have to do the 2 buttons. Granted, Cremation is also that way, but Cremation was, I think, better damage and allowed me to walk around while having full damage uptime, so there were some differences there. Then we have Ice Nova, which forced me into a 2-button playstyle with Frostbolt, but it had pretty good damage, so it was just kind of a little bit awkward, and I put it in B tier alongside Lightning Conduit. Next up, we have C tier. These are skills that excelled kind of at one thing or just were just below average on both things. But for example, Incinerate was really good damage, but it was absolutely abysmal clear. It is a very much you have to stand and shoot thing. but compared to Flame Blast, Divine Ire, and Storm Burst, it's just worse clear-wise in my opinion. Glacial Cascade was fairly solid damage-wise and fairly okay clear-wise. The issue I had with Glacial Cascade, and the reason I'm rating it a little bit lower, is you have to optimally position yourself. You have to stand a set distance away to make sure that final burst always hits the enemy, and just that little extra thought required in this makes it feel less good than other skills that it had similar damage and similar clear to, so that's why I rated it a little bit lower. Stormcall, an example of a skill that can scale very well if you get enough AoE to have all those hits overlap and shotgun, but for me, you have to force into less duration. It doesn't look very good without an MTX. It didn't feel great to play with the delay in the hit. I put it as a C tier for me. Ethereal Knives was fairly decent damage, fairly mid of the lane damage, but for it to clear, you really need to use a Pierce, you really need to use a Chain, something additional on top of just EK to make it clear. Otherwise, you just hit half the pack and then you need to shoot again. Heaven forbid there's 3 monsters in a row or something like that, where your projectiles don't pierce and stuff. You have to use an extra support gem to make it clear, okay? It's one of those skills where ends up can feel pretty good, but you need to invest in the prod speed and Pierce and Chain and whatnot. Next up, we have Flame Surge, which weirdly enough is pretty insane damage, but is absolutely abysmal clear, which no one's surprised. It has this tiny little cone shot that it does, and I don't know if you can get AoE to the point where it actually feels good to play, but for me playing it, it felt like it was terrible clear. Wave of Conviction, another case of it just without you investing into it. It's one of those skills where you want to shoot out the wave and it just go and chain kill things, but it really doesn't work on a hit-based skill without the Ignite Pro Lift to try to hit enemies outside the wave and whatnot. And didn't feel great clear. It was pretty good damage, and for that reason, I put it in C tier. Lightning Tendrils, similar to Incinerate, great, or not really great. This was weaker damage than Incinerate, maybe a little bit better clear, but pretty mediocre at best. Next up, we have Hydrosphere. I played this skill with Orb of Storms. It was pretty middle of the road damage, middle of the road clear. Same thing with Winter Orb. Frostbolt was decent damage, but its clear was really bad because you really need prod speed scaling. Otherwise, those things just travel so slowly and they take forever to accelerate and actually start killing things at a decent rate. And then Ice Spear I went over already for its issues with targeting and clear. And then, weirdly enough, Lightning Trap is one of the few trap and mine skills that rated highly. For this build, we didn't scale into traps or mines at all, so we have very little throw speed. We have a tree invested into cast speed on our clusters, so it doesn't really make sense that this could do well, but this actually impressed me. I realized today, or yesterday, that Lightning Trap is actually probably one of the strongest trap skills at base, just because if you do the alt quality, for the most part, you're getting a double hit. The 20% chance to return, I think, applies to every single projectile of like the 8 projectiles it shoots out. So most of the time you're getting a double hit with just the alt quality, which ends up taking this a decent amount above the other trap skills. Not only that, it has the ability to shoot omnidirectionally and hit enemies very far away. So it actually has pretty solid clear. So I was pretty impressed with Lightning Trap, to be honest with you. All right, that should round out the C tier. Let's go into the D tier, or where we start getting into more of the meme tier. That being said, these skills, even in D tier, are still, like, if you're doing a T16 boss, you're still eviscerating it in a matter of seconds. For example, I killed Hydra before he even did his phase with Lightning Warp. That doesn't make it a good skill, but it just means the build can carry these skills. Even if you want to play these skills, like say you wanted to map around with Body Swap, you could still do that. It's got a cool big explosion, invest into a little bit more AoE. You probably have a lot of fun with Body Swap, but in terms of power, it was just quite a bit weaker damage-wise, and so that's why it's in the D tier. Pretty cool to map with, but for clearing and killing enemies, it's a weird, slow flicker strike, and its damage compared to the other skills was just a lot weaker. Fireball was actually pretty similar damage to a lot of these skills in B tier, but it needs like multiple support gems just to make its clear actually good, and because of that, I rated it in the D tier. You can make the clear for Fireball pretty decent, I think, but at that point, you're sacrificing so many of the damage links, it would just be pretty sub-tier damage, and that's why I have it in D tier. And then after that, we have Lightning Warp, another meme skill. We were able to kill Uber Shaper with it, but it's not something I would ever recommend. Weirdly enough, Unearth, very good damage. It's a very fast casting skill that it does damage, but it has no clear. It's a very weird skill. It's basically like you're shooting just a beam of mud at people. And it's just abysmal clear. Very, very bad, even though the damage is okay. After that, we have pretty much all the mine skills: Storm Blast, Icicle Mine, and Pyroclast. This is just a matter of we don't really have throw speed. They felt better than most of the trap skills because the damage basically went off instantaneously, and they were, I think, a little bit more damage than most of the trap skills, except for Lightning Trap. And so I put them around D tier, even though we are not set up for mine skills. They still perform better than some of the other spells on the list. Holy Flame Totem felt okay to me because they could shoot from at least some level of range. Totem skills, even though our tree setup should be okay for totems, we have no survivability on these things, and they just died all the time in Uber Shaper to beams, degen grounds, whatever you name it. And there's a reason why Holy Flame Totems in D and Shockwaves in F. Shockwave, I think, is an amazing skill if you're set up for it. But the reason Shockwave is so low for me on this list is because you needed to be point blank with those things without the ring. I'm spacing the name. The ring that allows them to shoot enemies far away. You need to have those totems so close, and they were just infuriating during Uber Shaper because they just kept dying all the time. Because I'm not spec'd for totem HP. I tested out regardless. If you wanted to make a totem skill work with this build, you could, but you definitely would need to spec some totem survivability, in my opinion. After that, we have Soul Rend, one of the lowest hit-based skills possible. I guess I maybe should have tested Essence Drink because I think it might have a hit-based component too. It would probably rank similarly to Soul Rend, where it's just not really good damage. It's okay clear. It's better than some of the other skills on this clear-wise, but it is very weak damage-wise. Then we have Explosive Trap, Ice Trap, Fire Trap, all pretty similar. They're mid-tier damage. They feel bad to play. We don't have any trap investment. It's not a big surprise. Then we have Volatile Dead. This I tried with a Caswell Channeling Desecrate setup. I think I gimped the damage too much. Maybe if I had a separate Desecrate, like a 2-button playstyle setup, maybe the damage would have felt okay. If I was actually like just mapping in a T16 map, I was doing Uber Shaper. Uber Shaper is a pretty high bar in how much damage you need to deal, and I was comparing to other skills that are dealing quite a lot of effective damage. I think, honestly, if I was doing this in a T16 map, it would have felt good. We have plenty of damage to just go Castle Channeling, Desecrate, Volatile Dead, and have those heat-seeking orbs just go around killing things. Probably would feel great. But in Uber Shaper, we're really have a high context for what we need damage-wise, and the comparison was obvious that it was just much weaker damage-wise than most of the other skills on this list. All right, after that, we have Flamethrower Trap and Seismic Trap and Lightning Spire. Lightning Spire was just, I don't know if this skill does damage. It didn't feel like it really did damage. Flamethrower Trap and Seismic, they did pretty good damage, but I obviously wasn't spec for them. And they were on a massive cooldown, which makes them feel bad to play. So if you don't throw them at the right time to do the damage, they were kind of rough. At the last phase of Shaper, I actually tried running them in combination, like 2 of them at the same time. And that actually ended up working the best, where I was able to throw 3 Flamethrowers down and 3 Seismics down. And actually, I think like 1 phase the Uber Shaper on the last phase, which is pretty cool, but still gated by cooldowns. You don't really want this as your main skill running around because you just can't clear things. Blade Blast, this skill is abysmal without a proper, basically 2 skill setup, something like EK with return projectiles or a Blade Fall spell cascade conk effect setup. Quite frankly, our build just doesn't really feel like it has the extra gem links to support this, and so that's why I rate it lowly for this character. All right, already talked about Shockwave Totem. Let's go to the DD tier. DD tier was the first skill where I was like, this is just so bad, I want to rate it below F. Essentially, this skill, what makes it good is it scales a huge amount of base damage based on the corpse life. Our character is scaling a huge amount of base damage from our energy blade. And the issue is this skill has like 100% added effectiveness. So it's very low added effectiveness. And what makes it good is because normally you don't have a lot of base flat to work with. With Energy Blade, we do. So in that context, they're just not synergistic at all. And on top of that, it requires a 2-button playstyle, so there are issues there. Next up, we have Voltaxic Burst. This thing is a meme. It feels just terrible to play. If you want to build around the duration to stack up your hits or whatever, it's just this awkward delay. And when you cast the skill and you actually deal damage, it doesn't line up always with when the boss is here and you need to do damage and whatever it is, it feels terrible. Penance Brand, I'm sure I didn't have the duration or whatever necessary to make this skill function properly, but point is, it did not feel good to play. Galvanic Field felt terrible to play. Prismatic Burst is a meme, and Lightning Spire dealt no damage. Basically, everything here I would just not recommend at all because there are multiple issues with, I think, setup to make them work. Like, for example, Penance Brand, you need a specific amount of duration and cast speed to activate it correctly, which I did not have, and I didn't want to take the time to figure out to set up correctly. Or other skills like Galvanic Field, it's just too much work to try to set up the shock to then proc it on the enemy, and it's just lower damage than just using a lot of other skills that you could just deal that damage instantaneously and just have it work. For example, my idea when I did Galvanic Field was I was going to proc a big shock with Flame Blast, and then our Galvanic Field was going to kill the enemy. What ended up happening is I basically shot half the HP with my Flame Blast. The Galvanic Field sat there and then like ran out of duration before killing the enemy. And then I went to Flame Blast the enemy again to shock the enemy again for Galvanic Field, and I just killed it with Flame Blast. And it ended up basically being my Uber Shaper run where I was trying to set up Galvanic Field. I did most of the damage with my skill I was just trying to inflict the shock with. So it was like, this doesn't add up. All right, that is my list of skills I tested with the build, and that's my tier list. I'll have like a link to that. I'm not sure if it'll work, but it should below. Outside of that, I also set up a much cheaper version of the build. You'll see here we are 12k ES, 24k ES. We're much lower ES here. I actually set up an entirely different set of gear. We have our Uber Shaper kills here. We did about 57 of them. A couple of the skills we double up on, but pretty much every skill on the list that was D tier or above, we did the entire Shaper with. We did most of the F tier skills as well, the entire Shaper with. The DD tiers were the ones where I was like, this is so bad, I don't want to waste my time, and I subbed out another skill to finish the run type of thing. So that was our Uber Shaper kills. Oh, also, just for context, we did also do a Aberrath's Hooves Uber Shaper, which I guess was something. I don't recommend it. It's just on here because I thought it was funny, and that's that. All right. Now, we swapped out all of my gear I had on the character. This is the build I did the run with, for what is a much cheaper set of gear that I put together for about 36.4 divines was my rough estimation. I set this all up on stream last night. I will have a link to the VOD below where you can watch for a couple hours, watch me set up this entire gear set. And my conclusion was, for 40 divs, the build is pretty good. We did an Uber Shaper. I think we died once because I intentionally tanked an Uber Shaper Slam, which was stupid to do at 12k ES. At 16k ES, you get away with it about 80% of the time. At 12k ES, even if he low rolls, most of the time he's going to kill you. So that's kind of the difference there. And it's still a scenario where we turn off our Energy Blade, we tank the ad phase, whatever it is, or we tank the slam, and then we turn on the Energy Blade and we keep doing damage. The character here, the changes we made are we dropped Pain Attunement here. We just said, okay, the tattoo for Pain Attunement is going to cost multiple divines. I'm not going to put that in my lower or mid-tier budget. And so we took that out and we repathed over here. This is not ideal pathing, but Pain Attunement is that good. It makes it worth doing, in my opinion. And so if you get the higher investment, eventually you can roll Pain Attunement over here and you don't have to path like this. But that's what I went for. Also, I took out the Impossible Escape over here, which makes this cluster fairly decent to go for, because Impossible Escape for over here was about 7, 8, 9 divines, and I didn't want to spend that on this character's gear. The other changes we made is I swapped out my Unnatural Instinct for just a normal one. I had one with Reservation Efficiency, which I'm not sure was really helping me, because Reservation Efficiency you don't really want. You want to reserve as much life as possible and still be able to cast your skills. And I had like 200 life extra that I didn't need to cast my skills, so I'm not sure if that was ideal. And then on top of that, I swapped out my Lethal Pride. The thing you need to know for Lethal Pride, this thing you're going for is essentially you're going for strength, or strength double damage, whatever it is. And then ideally you want flat strength either on Path of Warrior or on Skittering Runes. Or if you can, get flat strength on both of these. The reason for that is Transcendent Mind deals or gives extra crit based on the flat strength on the nodes that aren't allocated. And actually, if you have flat strength here on Path of Warrior, that extra 20 flat strength is giving you an extra 20 multiplier on this jewel. So we actually get 100 crit multi from this jewel, which means we're getting about 25 crit multi per point, which is really efficient considering we don't have a lot of places we can grab crit multi on this tree. Technically, we could grab a couple crit multi here. If you want to do this instead of this jewel socket here, you can. That is an option, but that is what we are doing, and that's the idea of what we're doing right here. Also, you can, if you want to do an AoE skill, I should mention this, you can swap your Unnatural Instinct over to here. If you do this, I would recommend looking for a Lethal Pride that has flat strength on Path of the Hunter or Hired Killer, as that will make the crit multi number go up. You'll see over here we have 67 multi. If I had flat strength here and flat strength here, this would go from 67 to I think about 95. You'll see the difference between 105 over here. There's just a little bit more flat strength because this node has flat strength and whatnot, but that's the idea we're going with. Okay. On top of all that, I will go over the gear crafts pretty shortly just to explain how I crafted this gear, how I set it up. or you can check the VOD if you want a longer explanation or a walkthrough where I crafted each of the gear pieces. That is, of course, in the description below. Start things off with rings. You don't need anything super fancy. Basically, what I would recommend is a coral ring with either an intelligent fracture, an all attribute fracture, a cast speed fracture, or even a chaos res fracture if you want to end up capping your chaos res. If you end up wanting to do a forbidden right angle on the character, you could do something like that. Speaking of forbidden right, I did not include forbidden right or frostbomb on the list because I didn't test these. Forbidden right, I need to set up a character with chaos res, which means I need to finish crafting my gear a little bit more. And Frostbomb, its cooldown is too prohibitive. I didn't think it was worth running. It probably would be in here. That being said, I plan to do a optimized setup with cooldown ready to do with Impending Doom because I think Impending Doom is worth setting up a good setup for. And I might test Frostbomb at that point when I set that up. Now, as I was saying, Fractured Int, Fractured All Attributes, Fractured Cast Speed, any of those, you don't necessarily need a coral ring. It could be a reds ring if you're missing a little bit of reds. Like if you want on an amethyst and you want some to cap your reds there, you could do something like that. You have options, but the point is you start out with a fractured base like this, should be anywhere from 20 to 50 to 100 C. The reality is there's so many fractures you can go for. Just go for one that has a little bit lower roll. Like I have a 54 roll here. You don't need a perfect roll. Perfect rolls are how you end up spending an arm and a leg. It's just not necessary. And then all you do is you use rage essences and you are looking for either a T1 cast speed, T1 all attribute, T1 int, or T1 chaos res. There's like multiple things that you, if you hit, you're happy. On top of that, if you hit good life and an open suffix, that works too. For example, this ring here, I hit to good life and I had some okay ES and I said, you know what? I'll just craft the suffix and I'm done. If you hit good life and ES and you have a full suffix, you could attempt the null orb. But point is, we're just trying to craft a ring that has a lot of strength, a lot of int, maybe some cast speed, maybe some chaos res, and then call it a day. We're not getting too fancy with it. So the idea was I spammed this, I hit life, I said, that's good enough, and I walked away. And then the other scenario is when you spam this, eventually you might hit T1 int, and then it's simply all you do at that point is you do a wild bristle matron. It's a bestiary craft that will give you a suffixes can't be changed because the only prefix possible that's a meta mod is suffixes can't be changed. And then you do a veiled chaos, you block mana, and you unveil life. If you don't get a life unveil, you unveil flat damage and you benchcraft life and you just call it a day. For me, most of the time, 9 out of 10, you're going to get life, but sometimes you get a little bit unlucky and that's just how it goes. On average, these shouldn't cost you too much because you can hit so many win scenarios. So it's like, you're not just aiming for one mod, you're aiming for like a 5k weight pool because you're aiming for T1 life, you're aiming for T1 int, you're aiming for a lot of these mods, and there's a lot of success scenarios. You have to pay attention to them. And when you hit those things, just call it a day, walk away. These will be plenty good. For context, my current percent strength ring that I haven't finished crafting yet is actually weaker than this ring for my build. I actually just swapped it on just to see, and this made my ES go up by like 1,000, swapping in for my percent strength ring that wasn't crafted, and that's because it's pretty easy to craft a good ring without too much cost. Next up, for the belt, I recommend in terms of budget, if you want to save a little bit of money, because the belt craft that I talked about earlier requires 7.5 hunter exalts on average to hit. You can do something a little bit cheaper, which is essentially buying a Elder or a Hunter Stygian, awakening or orbing one with the other, so you have both Elder and Hunter influence. What this is, it doubles the weighting of attributes and percent life, because both Hunter and Elder have those two mods, which we care about. And then essentially you just do a fundamental fossil spam. On average, I believe it said it was like 163, I think was the number on Craft of Exile, to hit T1 strength or like T3 strength or higher, T1% attributes, and then either T1% life or like T3 flat life. I think it was like those sorts of mods. Essentially what you're going for is a 3 mod item where you can craft one more mod. So say you had high strength, high percent attributes, high percent life, just bench craft life. Say you had high flat life, high percent attributes, high flat strength, just bench craft on int. Something like that is what you're looking for, and that's what I have here on this belt. As for the boot craft, it is roughly a 1 in 4 if you do a Abyssal Jewel, a Hollow Fossil, plus Fundamental, plus Sanctified, and you're just going to do these a couple times until you hit like T3 int with Abyssal Socket, and then do a Wild Bristle Matron for the Suffix Can Be Changed, Veiled Chaos, Unveil Speed, Benchcraft Life, call it a day. I forgot to craft Action Speed and my other implicits on this jewel, but don't look at it, I just forgot about it. And then as for the Crown of the Inward Eye, just grab yourself a 16, a 17, a 15%, whatever seems a reasonable budget. This one cost me 100C, but if the rolls get a little bit more expensive, you can go lower on that. Essentially, we're just getting our character up and running, and this gives us enough reservation space. We do have to drop Tempest Shield over the, instead of the 80% mask, but this allows us to have much weaker res on our gear. For example, on my flasks, we are way overcapped now because I'm not using the Glimpse of Chaos, which actually reduces your resistances and makes it harder to cap res. Okay, after all of that, we have just a regular Ivory Tower. I recommend getting the 8% defense mod. It's about 1 in 4 Tailoring Orbs. That's my previous experience when I did a lot of Tailoring Orbs. That's about how many it takes to get 8% defense. It's roughly about 10% more ES, maybe more like 7%, but you get the idea. It's a decent amount more ES, and that's what I'd recommend. I just have a base one here, and then after that, just a Wrath Pith with a whatever corruption you can get, that's okay. Call it a day. Get yourself some Spell Crit Shaper's Touch. Fantastic. Get yourself just a random item. This is literally a item I got from Act 1, and I just threw a Hollow Fossil on it and then colored it to be green and red for my shield charge, and that's all we have there, and we turn it into an Energy Blade. After that, our last but not least is our Amulet. Amulet slot here, I recommend a 3-rat to craft that when you get the time to. It's a T3 Jorgen, and what you do is you get a all fractured base, all attribute fractured amulet. You use Rage Essence until you hit crit multi or cast speed, and then you do a Veiled Chaos, Unveil Life, Benchcraft % ES, and it's a 1 in 7 to hit a 3-rat amulet, which has the % attributes to it. Make sure you have the catalyst for attributes. This is a nice starter amulet, % attribute, % life. You could even do an Astramentus, which would be okay, which would be even more budget than this. Or you could do a % attributes, % crit multi, % attributes, % defense. All those would work. You don't have to do Eyes of the Great Wolf, but I think Eyes of the Great Wolf is a nice starter amulet. And this was about 5 divines of our budget. I think I bought it for 2 or something, but I counted it as 5 divines because I think maybe I got a good deal. I'm not sure, but you can do the math yourself on that one. It's okay. This is not a mandatory. This is not my recommended, but this is a nice little starter one for a few divines. Or you could buy one of the weaker 3-rats on the market, or buy just an okay amulet that isn't even a 3-rat, or do like a % strength amulet craft until you can afford to go and do the time and put in the hours to farm up multiple Jorgens and attempt multiple 3-rats to try to make yourself your amulet upgrade. For reference, if I'm going to put on this amulet, the main difference it makes is it gives us more ES, and it gives us crit multi we didn't have before. That's the main upgrade we're making in swapping out these amulets. It isn't a make or break on the build. It's just something where you get obvious improvements from 3-rats. If you have a max rolled Eyes of the Great Wolf, I think it's pretty competitive with a 3-rat. And you flip a coin as to which one I think is better. I'm not sure. Anyways, that is the budget gear. As for the jewels, I basically just set up a count search where I had % life, and then I had a search of like 9 mods with a count of 2 or 3, basically looking for strength. I wanted 1 jewel with flash duration, and then I wanted % ES, crit multi, cast speed, whatever it was, and you'll see that's basically what all my rare jewels are. They're either 3 mod or bad 4 mod jewels. If you go through all of them, that's what you should find. And then for Watcher's Eye, I went for a one that had basically a 2 mod between Wrath Pen, Wrath Crit, Zealotry Crit, or Zealotry Pen, Zealotry Cast Speed, multi-precision. You could do Vitality Regen, you could do Discipline Recovery Rate, you could do Discipline Block. There's a lot of different mods you could do. I just went for a 2 mod and called it a day. As for crafting our cluster, I recommend buying a 12 passive one and just chuck fundamental fossils at it until you hit some okay mods. If you hit 3 decent mods, go for a slam. This is just an okay result. Ideally, we'd rather have cast speed or strength in all attributes, but chaos res is okay, I guess, because our chaos res, we don't have much on the gear, and this works out all right. For our split personalities, we did strength and life and strength and life. These are just a lot cheaper than strength and int. Strength and int are better for the build. They give you a little bit more ES. Overall, I think the difference in strength and life versus strength and int on a character, basically I tested it on my high-end character where I just swapped them in and out. It was about, I think, a 1,000 ES jump or something difference, but it's still worth it to do these life and strength ones, which are quite a bit cheaper until you can afford the strength and int ones. All right, so that is the budget setup for the character. This is becoming a long video. I'm going to do a Uber Eater invite with the budget version of the build, or the mid-budget version of the build. This is just 40 divines, basically to give you a showcase of what it looks like. I don't know if I'd recommend it much cheaper than this, but I know I can strongly recommend it at this price range because I think it's quite a good character. We are going to be using Firestorm here, and we'll see if I can do this fight without breaking it too badly. Granted, this skill is very green cancery, so most likely I am gonna die to the what's it called? The tentacle phase or whatever. Now you'll see he does this phase. I turn off my energy blade. Now I'm doing this phase as if I had 24,000 energy with shield, which means I can tank a lot of this stuff a lot better than I would otherwise be able to do. And I can afford to jump around, turn on my energy blade once I feel like I'm in safety, back off a little bit, and do some more damage on this guy. Hunger is a dangerous attack. I'm going to dash out of there. I don't think this amount of ES is strong enough to counter that at this point, but it still does pretty decent, I think. Doing his phase again, I'm going to turn off my energy blade, and then we'll go stand on the things now. One more ball I need to go for over here. I'm gonna keep my energy blade off for now. I'll turn it back on now that he's back. Alright, let's try to finish this up. Alright, so that's what it looks like doing an Uber Eater with the current budget setup of the character. This should work well for basically any skill you want to slot in. Firestorm was one of the better damage skills, so obviously it's going to be a bit better at doing a boss like this. But quite frankly, I think most of the skills on the list, I could throw this budget version in here like this, and I could beat this fight, I'm pretty sure. Maybe some of the F tiers, it'd be real close, but I think D tier and above, most of those skills, I still would be able to do. The Uber Eater, most likely deathless, if not fairly consistently. All right, anyways. That is the more budget setup, and along with it, the tier list I have for all the different skills I tested personally. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you enjoyed this update. And until next time, take care, Exiles, and peace out. Have a good one.